When people looked at Adrian Mercer, they saw the kind of man the business world loves to use and rarely celebrates. A quiet genius with tired eyes, rolled-up sleeves, and the kind of patience that made difficult things look easy. The kind of founder who could sit in front of a whiteboard for 6 straight hours and come out with a system that saved a company millions of dollars, yet still let someone else take the microphone at the investor dinner that same night, and for nearly 8 years. That was exactly the role Adrian played inside Viridian Logic, the supply chain intelligence startup he had built from nothing in a rented warehouse office outside Dallas, Texas. Because while other founders chased headlines and gave slick interviews about disruption, Adrian was the one who built the engine, the actual engine, an adaptive logistics platform that could predict bottlenecks, reroute inventory, and prevent major shipping delays before they happened, a platform so good that major retailers began licensing it before the second year was over. And by the 4th year, Viridian Logic was one of the most talked about private software companies in the region. But the public face of that success was never Adrian. It was his wife, Vanessa Mercer, elegant, media-trained, camera-ready Vanessa, the company's chief external affairs officer and later its chief financial officer. The woman who knew exactly what to wear to a board meeting, exactly when to laugh during a negotiation, exactly how to place a hand on Adrian's arm in public, so people would think she was both his greatest supporter and his emotional anchor. And Adrian let her have that role because he loved her, because he trusted her, and because he had always believed that marriage was supposed to be a place where two people carried the same dream in different ways. So if his role was to stay up until 3 a.m. debugging the routing engine, while Vanessa smiled across polished conference tables and told investors that Viridian was changing the future of American distribution, then so be it, because in his mind they were winning together, and in the early years she knew exactly how to reward that kind of loyalty. She brought him coffee when he forgot to eat, kissed his forehead before major product launches, told him in private that none of this would exist without his mind, and in public, framed herself as the person who simply helped translate Adrian's brilliance into business language. And that sentence, simple and flattering, became one of the many ways she learned to take from him while making him feel appreciated. Because over time the pattern hardened, Adrian built, Vanessa represented, Adrian solved. Vanessa announced. Adrian created the architecture that made the company worth funding. And Vanessa stood beside investors and reporters as if she had equal claim to the foundation, and Adrian, being the kind of man who cared more about whether the software worked than whose face appeared in the trade magazine, kept handing her more room, more trust, more access, until eventually she controlled investor relations, external legal communications, and much of the company's licensing strategy, and he signed what she put in front of him because he believed her when she said it was just housekeeping, just efficiency, just the normal paperwork that serious companies needed as they scaled. And in those years Adrian worked harder than any human being should have. He missed anniversaries, skipped vacations, slept on the office couch during system migrations, and once spent 36 straight hours stabilizing a client deployment before driving home just in time to shower and show up at a charity gala where Vanessa accepted a Regional Innovation Award on behalf of the company, while he sat at table 9 smiling like a man who still thought love and trust were enough to protect a person from being strategically dismantled. And if anyone had asked him then whether he felt overlooked, he would have said no, because he was not hungry for applause. He was hungry for stability. He wanted Viridian to survive, to grow, to matter, and he thought that if he gave enough, if he kept choosing the company and the marriage over his own ego, one day the people closest to him would honor that sacrifice. But the truth about people like Adrian is that their loyalty often becomes the exact resource opportunists learn to mine. And the person who understood that best was not even Vanessa, not at first, but Caleb Thorne, a venture advisor with a glossy resume, expensive suits, a podcast voice, and the kind of polished confidence that sounded impressive to rooms full of money even when he said almost nothing of substance. Because Caleb specialized in positioning himself near talent without actually having any. He floated from startup to startup, calling himself a growth strategist, an executive advisor, a market architect, whatever title the room found expensive enough to trust. And when he first entered Viridian's orbit, Vanessa was the one who brought him in, telling Adrian that Caleb had strong investor relationships on both coasts and could help guide the company toward a larger Series C raise. And Adrian who disliked the man almost immediately for reasons he could not fully explain, still agreed. Because Vanessa insisted they needed someone who understood high-level capital strategy, and Caleb knew how to perform value in the way men like him always do. He asked broad questions in meetings using just enough jargon to sound sophisticated, praised Adrian's platform in vague but dramatic terms, and constantly flattered Vanessa in front of the board by calling her the real grown-up in the room, which made older investors laugh and made Adrian ignore the small, dry feeling in the back of his throat because he did not want to become the suspicious husband or the defensive founder. And that was how the trap held, not through one obvious betrayal, but through 1,000 small moments where Adrian chose trust over ego, patience over confrontation, work over politics, until the day the illusion finally cracked. And it cracked because Adrian had the habit all serious builders have. He checked systems personally, even after the company had grown large enough to delegate most oversight. And one Thursday evening, long after most of the office had cleared out, he was reviewing a permissions audit tied to Viridian's newest predictive module, a breakthrough extension of his original engine that could forecast supplier instability nearly 90 days ahead, a product feature that had the potential to double the company's valuation once rolled out nationally. And while tracing access to a sandbox environment connected to that module, Adrian noticed a sequence of unusual file exports, routed through an executive admin permission layer that should never have touched core engineering assets. And at first he assumed it was sloppy process. Maybe finance had accessed the wrong folder while preparing diligence packets for investors. But the deeper he followed the chain, the colder he became, because the exports were not random. They were structured, repeated, and tied to a private external repository under an entity he did not recognize, and the permissions authorizing those exports had been approved through Vanessa's office. And for a long time Adrian simply sat there staring at the screen, because the human brain does a strange thing when truth arrives too sharply. It stalls. It tries to offer alternative explanations to preserve the life you thought you were living. And Adrian wanted one of those explanations, wanted it badly, but he kept digging because unlike everyone else around him, he was still wired toward reality. And what he found was worse than theft, because theft would have at least been simple. What he found was a second company in formation, a shell venture structured under a Delaware holding group, with draft investor materials, brand mock-ups, early legal paperwork, and strategy memos describing the launch of a next-generation logistics intelligence platform that would compete directly with Viridian using the exact concepts Adrian had built, only framed in prettier language. And embedded in those documents was Caleb's name as operating partner and Vanessa's as co-founder. And Adrian felt something inside him go quiet in a way that was more frightening than anger, because this was not a mistake or a flirtation or a one-time lapse. This was long-term planning. This was two people sitting in the shadow of his labor while deciding how to strip him out of the future they intended to sell. And then came the personal blow, the one that removed whatever innocence he had left. Because while pulling archived files from a conference room camera system to verify dates tied to an after-hours investor presentation, Adrian found internal footage from several late evenings in which Vanessa and Caleb remained in the office long after staff had left, drinking, laughing too closely, disappearing together into the glass-walled strategy suite that Vanessa often claimed she used for quiet calls with East Coast funds. And later, when cross-referenced against message alerts from a synced office tablet Vanessa had once asked Adrian to configure. For presentations, there were private exchanges between them that left nothing to interpretation, not graphic, not explicit, but intimate in the most humiliating way, full of mocking shorthand, private jokes about how easy Adrian was to keep focused on the code, and chilling references to conversations where Caleb told Vanessa that once the new company launched, Adrian could be eased out with legal framing and reputational pressure because guys like him never know how to fight dirty until it's too late. And that was the moment Adrian understood the full shape of the double betrayal. His wife had not merely been unfaithful in secret. She had merged her deception with strategy, turning the marriage itself into a management tool, a softening device that kept him emotionally compliant, while she and Caleb extracted his intellectual property and prepared to remove him from the company he created. And if there was anything more devastating than the betrayal itself, it was the realization that some of the tenderness he had leaned on during his hardest years may have been partly performance. Maybe not all of it, maybe not from the beginning, but enough of it to poison memory, enough to make him revisit every late-night smile, every reassuring touch, every whispered promise after a difficult board meeting, and wonder whether she had already been planning the angle. And yet even then Adrian did not explode. Because men like Adrian do not respond to grief by becoming louder, they become more precise. And for 2 weeks he said nothing, changed nothing, confronted no one. Instead he copied records, documented access trails, preserved metadata, exported board correspondence, and quietly sent everything to an outside attorney under privilege. Because somewhere beneath the devastation his mind had already started doing what it always did, building structure where chaos threatened to swallow him whole. And he thought, perhaps still naively, that once the evidence was presented the board would have no choice but to see the truth. But Vanessa had spent years understanding one fact Adrian ignored. In any room where appearance outranks substance, the first convincing story often wins, and she moved before he did. Because the board meeting that destroyed his old life was called under the pretense of governance concerns around the upcoming product release. And when Adrian walked in carrying a clean folder of evidence, Vanessa was already seated at the far end of the table with red eyes, a glass of water, and the posture of a woman trying very hard to remain composed under private distress. And Caleb was on the video screen looking grave, not flashy, not smug, but concerned in the polished way consultants become concerned when their fees depend on someone else being discredited. And before Adrian could even open his folder, Vanessa spoke, softly at first, saying this was difficult, saying she had delayed out of loyalty, saying she feared how Adrian might react if she raised these issues privately. And then she began building a version of reality so calculated that for a moment Adrian actually felt the room tilting away from him before he understood why. She described him as brilliant, but increasingly controlling, emotionally volatile, suspicious of anyone who brought market-facing expertise into the company, especially Caleb, and claimed that over the previous year Adrian had isolated her from key decisions, lashed out when challenged, and begun positioning her as a scapegoat whenever board members asked valid questions about governance. She even framed the very documents he had collected as evidence of his obsession, saying he had been monitoring office systems and compiling materials to intimidate her after she raised concerns about ethical oversight. And then she delivered the move Adrian would remember for years. She told the room that much of the new predictive module was built from external strategic frameworks and commercialization planning that originated through collaborative sessions led by her and Caleb, and that Adrian, unwilling to share power, was now trying to claim sole ownership of ideas that had actually emerged as a team effort. And because she was crying just enough, and because Caleb reinforced her narrative with calm language about founder instability and the need to protect the company, and because the board had always been more in love with Vanessa's polish than Adrian's process, the people around that table did what frightened people in expensive suits so often do. They sided not with the truth, but with the story that felt most manageable. And Adrian tried. He truly tried. He showed file histories, approval trails, external entities, and the private repository structure, but every piece of evidence he introduced was reframed as either misunderstanding or retaliation. And when he referenced the personal relationship between Vanessa and Caleb, the room chilled in the exact way it does when someone reveals a truth the audience has already been coached to view as the desperate outburst of the unstable party. Vanessa lowered her eyes and said she had feared he might make false and deeply personal accusations if matters escalated. And one older investor actually leaned back in his chair and said, with infuriating calm, that the board's priority had to be the health of the enterprise, not the emotional collapse of one executive. And just like that, Adrian was no longer the founder who built their most valuable product. He was the risk, the legal concern, the emotionally compromised husband whose judgment could supposedly no longer be trusted. And by the end of the meeting his access was suspended. His voting rights as a founder were frozen pending review under clauses Vanessa had helped structure years earlier. And communications to staff described his departure as a temporary leave related to governance tensions, though everyone understood what it meant. And if that had been the only loss, perhaps he could have contained it. But Vanessa filed for separation within days, framed publicly as a sad but necessary response to a pattern of emotional pressure and controlling behavior. And because she controlled the company narrative and most of the investor relationships, Adrian found himself exiled from both his marriage and his own creation at nearly the same moment. His name stripped from press materials, his system repackaged by people who could not have built it if they had 10 years and unlimited money. And for the first time in his adult life, Adrian had nothing to work on except the wreckage of his own trust, and those months after his exile were the closest he ever came to disappearing into bitterness. He rented a furnished one-bedroom apartment outside Fort Collins, Colorado, because he wanted distance from Texas and distance from everyone who had watched him be replaced, and he lived there with 2 duffel bags, a laptop, and a silence so complete that it felt physical, a weight pressing against his ribs each morning when he woke up and remembered that the 2 structures he had organized his life around, his company and his marriage, had both been used against him by the same person, and there were days when he barely spoke, days when he stared at code he could not bring himself to write, days when the worst part was not losing money or status, but replaying every moment he had mistaken manipulation for love. Every time Vanessa had touched his shoulder while privately negotiating his removal, every speech where she thanked him by name while building private rooms that excluded him. And what saved Adrian, in the end, was not comfort, because there was almost none of that, and not revenge at first, because he was too hollow for rage to sustain him. What saved him was structure. The oldest language his mind knew, and one morning, after nearly 3 months of drifting through grief like a man lost in freezing water, he opened a blank document and wrote a sentence that changed everything. If they needed me invisible to steal from me, then my mistake was never my mind. It was my lack of boundaries. And once he saw that sentence in front of him, the next one came, and then the next, until by noon he had outlined not just what had happened, but what he would never again allow. And from that day forward, he rebuilt himself the way he rebuilt broken systems, piece by piece. First by formalizing what had once existed mostly in his head, not just code but method, authorship chains, architecture trees, independent validation stamps, contribution proofs, immutable development logs. He designed technical safeguards around creative ownership because he now understood that talented people often lose not because they lack value, but because they leave too much of it undocumented. And then he began building a new platform, not a copy of Viridian's engine, but a superior evolution of it, one that could model distribution risk in real time using dynamic supplier confidence mapping, a system faster, cleaner, and vastly more resilient than the one Vanessa and Caleb were trying to commercialize without him, and unlike the desperate founder he might once have been, Adrian did not chase old investors or plead for validation from the people who had abandoned him. He went after operators, serious people, quiet logistics veterans, regional manufacturers who cared less about headlines than whether trucks arrived on time. And those people listened because once Adrian began speaking again, he no longer sounded like a gifted engineer hoping someone else would translate his value. He sounded like a man who finally understood it himself. And within 18 months his new company, Atlas Core Systems, moved from prototype to pilot to revenue, not with glamorous launch parties or magazine covers, but with undeniable results. Missed shipments reduced, spoilage cut, margins improved, and soon the clients came faster than he expected, then strategic partners, then a new funding round led by disciplined investors who performed real diligence instead of falling in love with glossy presentations. And by year 2 Atlas Core was worth more than Viridian had ever been under his control. And Adrian, who had once lived like a servant inside his own success, now moved through his days with a quieter kind of authority, still reserved, still deeply focused, but no longer eager to disappear behind someone else's charisma. And all the while, almost as if reality were finally correcting itself, Viridian began to rot, because no amount of branding can sustain a company built on talent you've expelled. Vanessa and Caleb rolled out the upgraded platform with impressive language and expensive promises, but the product underperformed. Patches failed, forecasts drifted, clients complained, and the more they tried to compensate with marketing, the more obvious their lack of real command became. Because Caleb knew how to posture through a keynote, and Vanessa knew how to soothe a board call, but neither of them knew how to repair the machine they had stolen. And when major accounts began leaving, the internal blame started. with Caleb accusing engineering teams of poor execution and Vanessa pushing emergency financing to keep the facade alive. But money burns quickly when the people in charge mistake momentum for competence. And then the private unraveling became public, because the same kind of man who betrays with charm usually keeps betraying once conditions change. And Caleb, who had once made Vanessa feel like the smartest woman in every room, started slipping away with younger media consultants and event coordinators, leaving traces not because he was careless exactly, but because men like him eventually stop respecting the person they once seduced when that person can no longer supply power. And Vanessa discovered, too late and with exquisite humiliation, that the man she helped destroy her husband for was also diverting company funds through layered advisory fees into side vehicles he controlled, preparing his own exit while promising her they would stabilize everything together. And when that came to light, the board panicked. Lawsuits started circling, creditors pressed, and the same investors, who once treated Vanessa like a visionary, began talking about serious judgment failures, as though they themselves had not clapped for every polished lie that made Adrian look expendable. And Caleb vanished first, naturally, stripping out what he could, resigning through counsel, and reappearing weeks later in Miami attached to a different startup and a different woman barely old enough to remember the early smartphone era, leaving Vanessa to face the wreckage largely alone. And Viridian, without Adrian's mind and after Caleb's extraction, collapsed into asset sales and emergency restructuring, its reputation gutted, its valuation reduced to a fraction of what it had once been. And if there was any justice more satisfying than watching their stolen kingdom fail, it was seeing the logic behind the failure become undeniable. They had not been builders, they had been borrowers, and borrowed brilliance expires when the source is cut off. And eventually, as Adrian always suspected would happen, Vanessa came back, because collapse has a way of pushing even proud people toward the door they once kicked closed. And she came not at night, not dramatically, but on a Wednesday afternoon to Atlas Score's Denver headquarters, dressed in muted designer clothes that tried to look humble and carrying a face Adrian barely recognized, thinner, strained, still beautiful in the expensive, maintained way she had always been, but stripped now of the confidence that once let her walk into any room and assume admiration would rise to meet her. And she asked the receptionist to speak to him privately, saying it was personal, saying they had history, and under old conditions Adrian might have refused immediately. But the man he had become no longer feared seeing her, so he allowed her into a small executive conference room with glass walls and a long walnut table. And when she entered he stood, not out of affection, just out of habit. And for a second she seemed thrown by how composed he looked, because Adrian no longer had the softness she used to manage. There was no visible wound she could press, no restless need in him to understand her, only calm. And she began exactly the way he expected, with tears she tried not to show too quickly, with language about mistakes, pressure, confusion, manipulation, saying Caleb had poisoned everything, that she had been in over her head, that she had made choices she regretted every single day. And then she shifted into the tone she used to use when she wanted him to forgive her before he had time to think, reminding him of the early years, the cramped office, the Chinese takeout on the floor, the nights they dreamed together about building something meaningful. And for a brief moment Adrian did feel something move inside him, not love, not longing, but mourning for the man who had once believed those memories belonged to a real partnership, because that man had worked himself half to death for a future Vanessa later tried to monetize without him. And when she saw him stay quiet she took it as an opening, moving closer, lowering her voice, saying she knew she did not deserve anything, but asking if he could at least help her start over, maybe with a role somewhere, maybe an introduction, maybe guidance, saying she had no one, that she had been used to, that whatever happened between them, they had once been family. And there it was, the final manipulation, dressed this time in ruin instead of glamour, the attempt to convert shared history into a bridge back into his life. And Adrian looked at her for a long moment and realized the strangest thing of all. He was not angry, because anger would have implied she still had access to his emotional center, and she did not. What he felt instead was a cool, absolute respect for the distance he had fought to create. And he said her name once, quietly, and slid a folder across the table. And When Vanessa opened it, her expression changed before she had even finished the first page, because inside was not just a record of the original theft, though that was there, complete with file logs, approval trails, and entity links, but also sworn statements, forensic financial summaries, preserved internal messages between her and Caleb, licensing irregularities, board correspondence, and documentation Adrian had chosen not to release publicly during the first collapse because at the time, survival mattered more than public destruction. But now, sitting in that glass conference room above a company that existed because he rebuilt his life without her, he no longer had any reason to protect what was left of her professional future, and he told her, in the same calm tone he might have used to explain a contract clause, that Atlas Corp was entering a major partnership round with several national logistics firms, and as part of due diligence those partners had asked whether any unresolved reputational or intellectual property issues existed involving former competitors. He explained that he had so far responded narrowly and professionally. But if Vanessa continued attempting to leverage personal history for access, employment, or influence, he would have no choice but to share the full evidentiary record with every partner, board, and legal team now reviewing the sector. And because he understood systems better than she ever would, he made sure she understood the consequences in human terms, not yelling, not threatening in the crude sense, simply stating that once this file circulated, no serious investor, operator, or executive search firm would touch her again, not because he had slandered her, but because her own documented actions would define her. And Vanessa stared at him like she was seeing a different species of man than the one she used to manage with tears and selective tenderness. And maybe she was, because the old Adrian might have explained himself, might have asked why, might have wanted her to admit the truth in a form that soothed his pain. But this Adrian did not need confession. He needed boundaries. And when she started crying harder, saying he was being cruel, saying he had become cold, saying she had lost everything, he did not argue. Because sometimes the cleanest form of justice is refusing to debate your right to protect yourself. And then she made one last desperate move, the oldest one, telling him that despite everything he knew the connection they once had was real, that some part of her had loved him, that people make terrible mistakes when ambition and fear get twisted together. And for the first time in the conversation, Adrian's face changed, not into pity, not into rage, but into something even harder for her to bear, recognition without surrender. And he told her that maybe some part of what they had was real once, but whatever truth had existed could not survive being used as cover for betrayal. And he said the line she would probably remember longer than any threat. I can forgive the fact that you wanted more, Vanessa, but I will never again let you use my trust as financing. And then he stood, collected the folder back from her hands, removed 3 pages, and placed those pages on the table in front of her. Pages summarizing the most decisive records, the ones he was prepared to share the moment she crossed another line. And he informed her that security would escort her out through the private elevator to avoid unnecessary attention, not as a kindness, but as his final professional courtesy. And when she realized there would be no opening, no rescue, no emotional collapse she could exploit, something in her finally broke, and she began pleading in a way that would once have shattered him, asking for one chance, one conversation, one way to fix what she had done. But Adrian was already walking toward the door, not dramatically, not triumphantly, just finished. And before he stepped out, he turned once and said, without raising his voice, "You did not lose me today, Vanessa. You lost me the day you decided my loyalty was something you could spend." And then he left her in the glass room with her tears, her ruined leverage, and the full weight of a future she had built for herself, one manipulative choice at a time. And later that week, when one of Atlas Corp's partners asked in a routine diligence call whether there was any material risk involving Vanessa Mercer or the remains of Viridian Logic, Adrian answered with perfect precision, provided the relevant documentation through counsel, and watched the final door close exactly as it should have. And that was the part no one who knew the old Adrian would have believed. Not that he won, because talented people sometimes do recover, but how he won, without shouting, without begging to be understood, without destroying himself trying to drag the truth into rooms that had once preferred lies. He won by becoming undeniable, by documenting what he built, by refusing access to the same woman who once weaponized intimacy against him. and by learning the hardest lesson a loyal man can ever learn, that love without boundaries is not devotion, it is exposure. And if there was any catharsis in the years that followed, it was not merely that Vanessa had fallen or Caleb had exposed himself as the hollow fraud Adrian always suspected he was. It was that Adrian no longer needed their downfall to prove his worth, because every truck route optimized by Atlas Core, every major contract won on the strength of his actual mind, every boardroom where people now listened when he spoke, every morning he woke up without the old heaviness in his chest, all of it testified to the same truth. The thing they tried to steal from him had never really been the code or the company. It had been his confidence in his own value. And in the end, that was the one asset they failed to keep, because once Adrian rebuilt it on evidence, discipline, and self-respect, there was nothing left for people like Vanessa and Caleb to take. And somewhere out there they would keep telling themselves stories about how things got complicated, how pressure changed people, how timing ruined everything. But Adrian no longer cared what story they told, because he had finally learned to live inside the only one that mattered, the truth.